5, 4, 3, 2.
Good morning. This is the Palm Beach Post's editorial board interview with Alex Sink, Democratic candidate for governor of Florida. Welcome, Ms. Sink. Thank you for coming. Would you like to start with a short statement?
Yes, I will. I would like to make a few brief comments. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to come before the Ed Board. I think this is a long-honored tradition that we've had in the state of Florida to have candidates appear before Ed Boards. I'm happy to be here. I think it's important that Floridians are able to hear firsthand in some more depth than the 60-second soundbite what the candidates' positions are on issues, and I know you have many questions. I did want to just say that the reason I'm running for governor is because I'm not a career politician. I ran for the office of CFO for the first time in my life 4 years ago. Didn't necessarily expect to be running for governor, but the reason I got into elected office is because I thought I could use my business experience to go to Tallahassee and make change and look out for the taxpayer money. And we've had a very successful, I believe, 3.5 years in my term as the CFO. But our state has a lot of economic challenges now. And I believe that I can bring my background and my experience, both 26 years in business and the 3.5 years I've spent in Tallahassee, to the governor's office. And so I've put together a very specific, detailed economic plan to put Floridians back to work. And I also think that Floridians are looking for leaders with honesty and integrity. Of course, you know all too well, being right here in Palm Beach County, the issues that have come up in the past several years. And in fact, 2 years ago, I participated with Leadership Palm Beach in a forum to discuss what kind of ethics reforms might be needed in government. And I have put forward a 11-point plan for ethics reform in state government. And we just continue to see a culture of corruption, not only in Tallahassee and in our local governments, but I believe that elected officials have to be held accountable. And that's what I've been about my whole career, is accountability and transparency, disclosing to Floridians. They need to know a lot about their governor candidate and what their governor will do when he or she takes office. So that's what I'm here today to do, is to answer your questions and share my thoughts with
we'll try
your listeners.
Try to tell the people watching who will be reading the paper a little bit more about you. What do you see as the sharpest distinctions between you and Rick Scott?
Our background in terms of integrity and trust. What I've seen in Rick Scott is that he built a company that was based on, had a culture of, in effect, defrauding the taxpayers. He got his start in El Paso, Texas, and then continued to buy hospitals. His whole model was to buy hospitals and then shut them down. And ultimately, the feds raided 33 of his hospitals. 20 of them were right here in Florida. So I think Floridians have a lot of questions about his background and the way he does business. And of course now, in the primary and now in the general election, we've seen that he's spending his money mainly playing ads against his opponents that are full of falsehoods and lies and deceptions and smears. And I, on the other hand, have had 26 years living right here amongst Floridians, being an active participant and a community leader. I've been a statewide business leader in Miami, in Tampa, Jacksonville, Tallahassee. I've been certainly a financial contributor to many nonprofits, and I'm proud of the record in business, and I have never, up to now, when he brings things up, I've never been associated with any kind of smear or scandal. I also think that there's a big issue in terms of disclosure. We have a long time-honored tradition in Florida of our gubernatorial candidates for 40 years have always been willing to disclose their tax returns. And so my husband and I, many weeks ago, made 5 years' worth of our tax returns available, and Rick Scott has yet to disclose his financial information. That causes, that's a serious question in my mind, and a true difference between us.
Can you cite an example or two of what you call falsehoods and lies in his ads?
Oh, absolutely. One of his ads says that my former company, and I have been gone from the Bank of America for more than 10 years now, but he says that my former company was awarded a no-bid contract, a bond contract at the state. Well, the facts are...
This is when you were CFO and on the State Board of Administration, correct?
It's the board that oversees the Division of Bond Finance actually includes the Ag Commissioner.
Okay.
So it's all four of us. That it was a no-bid situation when, in fact, we got, the Division of Bond Finance got 37 proposals for those particular bond issues. 37 proposals. It was competitive. The staff of the Division of Bond Finance evaluated the proposals. They recommended to the board that Merrill Lynch, which actually at the time was not even owned by the Bank of America, that Merrill Lynch lead this particular syndicate of lenders, and the vote was 4-0 to follow the staff recommendation.
And when you, I believe, were with Nations Bank in the late 90s, the company was fined $37 million, I think, $37.5 million, something like that, for, I believe, securities violations. You're selling fraudulent securities. Would you like to address that?
Oh, sure. That was a fine that was paid by a subsidiary company called Nations Securities. It was a brokerage operation. I had no authority or control at all. In fact, it was not legal for me as a traditional commercial banker to have any authority or control over that separate subsidiary company, which was managed by different executives and was reporting right into Charlotte. And even the attorney...
Charlotte being the home office.
Charlotte is the home office, yes. And even the attorney who brought the class action suit against Nations Securities has said that, and acknowledged that Alex Sink had absolutely nothing to do with that particular case and that company.
We'll come back to some of that stuff in just a second. We'd like to go with a quick rundown of some of the issues that have drawn a lot of attention recently and get your thoughts on what you would have done if you had been governor. Would you have signed or vetoed the teacher merit pay bill that passed the legislature this spring?
Oh, I definitely would have vetoed it.
Okay, can you explain why?
Yes. I support the concept and philosophy behind performance pay or merit pay for teachers. I do believe our great teachers should be rewarded for their performance. However, what I've learned being in Tallahassee and in state government is the devil's frequently in the details. What sounds like a good concept can frequently become really, when you look at the details of that legislation, it was all about Tallahassee bureaucrats and politicians taking over and overly influencing local schools making decisions.
Get a little more specific about your objections to what was in the bill.
Yes. I mean, there were things in that bill like saying that school boards couldn't decide on their own whether or not they wanted to reward a teacher who decided to go back to school and get a master's degree or a PhD. That wouldn't have been permitted. And there were many features in that bill that were very prescriptive in nature about how you would install a performance pay plan.
Prescriptive meaning?
Meaning, okay, this is like a cookbook. This is the way you build your performance pay plan. It has to be only based on the FCAT, for example, and you can't offer credit for teachers who further their education. And I just think that is, I think it's wrong. Okay. I think that it's important for local school boards and teachers and superintendents to work together to build a performance pay plan that works for that particular county, because Palm Beach County is not the same as Hardee County, for example.
Would you have signed the nursing home bill that contained the amendment requiring any woman in Florida seeking an abortion to get an ultrasound?
No, I would not have signed that bill, because I don't think that the government has a place in making personal or influencing personal medical decisions that should be made between a woman and her physician.
Okay. Would you have signed the property insurance bill that passed the legislature this year?
The 2044?
Correct. Senate Bill
Yes,
2044.
I would have signed 2044.
And in a related issue, do you favor deregulation of property insurance in Florida?
Absolutely not.
Do you have any thoughts on how you can improve the market and perhaps lower premiums?
Well, I have many thoughts about how the market can be improved.
Can you give us one or two now?
Definitely. I'll keep it short. We need to be able to attract global private capital back into the Florida marketplace. And one of the things that I hear, because I talk to private insurers quite a bit in my current role as the CFO and as the insurance consumer advocate for the state, who I appoint. And one of the things they bring up over and over again is that we have a very difficult and uncertain regulatory environment. In other words, when they want to introduce new products or a different version of a property insurance product, sometimes it takes years for them to get approvals made through the insurance commissioner. And so, for one thing, we've got to streamline and make our decision-making more consistent so that companies will know, gosh, we have a great new idea, we think this is going to be a good product, we know that we'll file our application and within 90 days there's going to be a yes or no to it. Instead, now it drags on and on. So that's number one. And secondly, we have to be sure that the rates that are being charged are not onerous on the consumer, but they are sufficient to maintain financial stability of these companies so that when the storm comes, they have the ability to pay their claims. And we've just been in an environment, unfortunately, for 4 or 5 years where the answer for any kind of proposed, even modest rate increase has just been no. And what that's caused in the marketplace is that private capital is not willing to come here if they don't believe that their legitimate cases can be approved if they are in fact deserving of some price increase.
And this is a look-ahead question. If the legislature passes the immigration legislation as drawn up by Representative Snyder, the one based on the Arizona law, would you sign that?
This is what I would do with the legislature. I have a proposal for immigration reform, and of course, you're asking very specific questions, which I'll answer, but let me step back and share with your viewers and you a little bit about my philosophy about how I'm going to run the governor's office. As governor, obviously I have the veto power over the legislature, so I'm not going to let the legislature kind of go down a path of something that is not going to be acceptable to me as governor. Rather, I have a philosophy that the governor's office should be involved with the legislators in the front end of developing meaningful legislation. My proposal on immigration is, let's just go back and say that the federal government has really failed us. Congress should have passed comprehensive immigration reform long ago, but they haven't done it. And I understand the frustrations of people in a state like Arizona who has so many border issues. But Florida is not Arizona. So if we are to, and I have proposed the Florida type of immigration legislation that focuses in on what I believe is more appropriate and effective for Florida, which is to increase the fines and penalties on businesses who knowingly hire illegal immigrants and take jobs away from Floridians. And I've spoken often with law enforcement about what their proper role is. Law enforcement is permitted now to arrest illegal immigrants, but the budgets, you know this, have been incredibly stretched, and they do not want to assume the responsibility of the federal immigration authorities and get distracted from the very important job at hand here in Florida, which is to protect our citizens from everyday crime and sometimes violent crime.
And just to review for the viewers, the legislature's bill basically would allow local police and sheriff's deputies to arrest people who they suspected of being illegal immigrants if they had stopped them for another offense. So how is what you're proposing, or you would want the state to do, different from what the legislature is proposing?
Well, I have not read the bill that you're referencing.
Okay.
And I think it's, as governor, it's really...
You should have done that?
No.
Okay.
What?
Well, it just seems like it's a pretty...
Well, there are hundreds of bills that have been filed by or have been proposed by legislators. I think what I should be doing is what I'm doing right now, is sharing with Floridians what my approach would be in terms of addressing the problems of illegal immigration. And I do have a plan, and it's on my website, and you can see what the Alex Sink plan for immigration reform is. So
just, again, because people may not want to go to the website right now, but basically your approach would be to not have the police and sheriffs do that work, but to be tougher on businesses. To
be tougher on businesses, and our law enforcement, obviously, right now, let's go back and think about that. They have the authority right now to arrest illegal immigrants, and they do. In fact, let me give you, I'll give you a very real example of in my own Department of Financial Services. We do a lot of work around workers' comp right here out of our Palm Beach office. We uncovered a situation where a landscape firm was hiring illegal immigrants and telling them to go out into the right-of-way, the highway, FDOT highway right-of-way, and pick up plants so that they could be resold. And when we investigated that, we found a number of illegal immigrants who were using somebody else's social security number of 18-year-olds, and you better believe they were arrested.
So do you want local law enforcement to begin going out and searching out illegals and arresting them? You say they have the power, but are you sympathetic to the argument that they should be arresting people?
It's a matter of how we want our law enforcement to be spending their time.
How do you want
It's not, I want them to be spending their time protecting Floridians from serious crimes.
On the State Board of Administration, which oversees Florida's vast pension resources, there is little doubt that around 2007, it was investing in risky securities that it should not have been investing in. And the state...
Well, I would challenge that, but
so
you can explain yourself further.
You don't think that when the local government investment pool had to freeze
that's
its
different.
assets?
You mean outside of the retirement system, the local government investment pool?
Right. The state was also, the SBA was also overseeing that.
Yes.
And it was making risky investments that it shouldn't have been making, and it doesn't seem to have come to your attention, and you seem to have not explained how that happened on your watch.
Well, when the executive director is not informing his board members that he's got he's got investments that look like they are in trouble, which he did not, then he got to leave his job at my request, because it's the responsibility of the executive director to keep his board members informed. he had a problem beginning in August of that year and did not inform the board until sometime in the fall. I can't remember exactly what month. It was oops, we've got some investments in here that look like they're being devalued and are causing a serious problem for our fund. That's the responsibility of the board, to ensure that the executive director is doing his job.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you're blaming staff or blaming somebody else, but isn't that also what Rick Scott has done with HCA?
No, that's very different.
How is it different? If there are 3 people who are overseeing the executive director who is off investing an awful lot of money.
Let's
badly.
go back. When I became aware that there were problems in the management of the local government investment pool, I held the person responsible accountable. And then got involved, as people here in Palm Beach County will tell you I did. I got involved in trying to solve the problem. Rick Scott built a company whose culture was giving illegal kickbacks to physicians for referrals of patients to his hospitals. For 4 years, he was disclosing, or they were disclosing in their financial statements that the company was engaged in activities that were subject to enforcement action by the federal government, and he didn't do anything about it. That's a huge difference.
Well, the St. Petersburg Times, which went back and looked at all the emails, found time and again the people who were doing the investment for the SBA looking for a way around the rules that would have stopped these investments. None of those emails ever came to your level, or should have?
No. This is a $110 billion fund. They do tens of thousands of transactions every year, and none of those emails were ever brought to the attention of the board members. But, you know, there's really a bigger issue here, and it goes back to my call for, I'm the only trustee who's called for major reforms in the governance structure of the SBA. I asked for a study of how other states' governance is set up. In other words, who are the board members? We have a situation here in Florida where 3 politicians, none of whom are required to have any financial background or experience.
Governor, the Attorney General, and the Chief Financial Officer.
Yes. Those 3 individuals are the trustees of the 4th largest pension fund in this country, and I don't think that's an appropriate governance structure. And so I called for adding additional board members who would be required to have requisite or the needed financial experience or investment experience to serve on the oversight board, and neither the governor nor the attorney general would go along with my suggestions. But when I'm the governor, I'm going to bring that legislation back. And I also did call for other forms that were passed in legislation this year. For example, in our board, the board was basically meeting for about 10 minutes every 2 weeks to do the business of the state pension fund. And that's just not right.
Sticking with pensions just for a second, Mr. Scott has proposed, among other things, that he would save $1.4 billion a year from changes to the way the state does its pension. I believe, among other things, he hasn't said it directly, but his website says that Florida is one of the only states where workers don't pay into the pension. Do you think that there should be any changes in how the state's pension fund and the rules are set up? And I ask this in part because we had a couple of comments from people who I believe are sheriff's deputies who say that they have heard that there is talk of changing the rules to have them work 30 years, not 25 years. Could you address both of those? I think there are some savings to be done. Would you change the way Florida pays for its pension fund, and how does it might apply to deputies?
Well, Right now, actually, at the end of 2008, Florida's pension fund was actually in an overfunded position, meaning that the actuaries, the experts, determined that the monies in the pension fund were quite sufficient to handle the obligations of the fund with the current benefit structure way out into the future. Now, clearly, the market has the global stock market took a big decline in the past 2 years. However, Florida's pension fund has recovered substantially. And the Pew Trust, who's an independent, well-respected authority, just named Florida's fund as one of the 4 or 5 strongest public pension funds in the country. So we're in a very good, we're in a good position right now. What we have to do as caretakers of the fund is to be sure that we continue to be in an adequately funded position.
Okay,
and
so
I would not advocate. I don't advocate any additional benefits given, and if we get into...
What about any more contributions from employees?
Well, it depends on, I think we ought to look at whether or not we're in a good position or not. If you're asking me today, I think we're okay. And I think we also have to recognize that when we think of total compensation, the salary levels of Florida state employees are typically lower than the marketplace. And what I have been told is that in the past, the reason for that is because Florida employees, people who are eligible for these pensions, have been promised that they're taking lower salaries today, but they'll be able to be assured of their pension payments in the future if they put the 30 years or whatever it is into the system.
Okay.
What about the retirement period for deputies?
It's...
They say that you want to...
Well, I'm not recommending any changes. I haven't addressed it, and I'm not recommending any changes as a part of my positioning as governor. But I think we have to be realistic that if we got into a situation with another major decline in the stock market, or there were other financial pressures put on the pension fund that would put in jeopardy the state's ability to fulfill that promise, then yes, everything should be on the table. But rather than what I would do, my approach would be to change the plan for people who are coming new employees who are coming into the system, or people who are relatively newer employees, so that they have time to prepare and to save their own money and to shore up their own personal pension.
So you wouldn't be looking.
perspective.
You don't think that Mr. Scott's idea of saving $1.4 billion on the pension fund is proper, realistic, whatever?
It doesn't seem realistic to me.
Okay.
Can you tell us what you will do as CFO and as governor if elected to address the foreclosure fraud alleged by the banks and the law firms recently?
Mm-hmm. I think it's probably, well, let me go back and just talk about, as CFO, some of the things I have done. Obviously, it's really a governor and attorney general's focus. And they have the power. Let's just talk about power.
Well, the court ruled yesterday that the Attorney General does not have the power to investigate the law
not up in the nose.
Yeah.
Doesn't have the power
to investigate the law firms that have been accused of filing false affidavits that they are under the purview of the bar and the financial services department has to regulate the banks. So that's
the Office of Financial Regulation, which is a cabinet agency. Well, good. Well, we ought to, the cabinet ought to then, we've got a cabinet meeting on Tuesday. We'll bring it up if it is the responsibility of the Office of Financial Regulation. That comes under the 4 members of the Florida cabinet.
Well, a question that a number of people have raised is whether, and this is Congress, not you, but as governor, would you favor Congress allowing bankruptcy judges to modify the the principle of a home loan. You're a former banker. The banking industry really opposes this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that when the bank, if the bankruptcy judge is actually going to read the documents and and address the situation of the borrower, I think it should be something that the bankruptcy judge should be able to consider.
Okay, so you would be okay with that if Congress gave them that power?
If Congress decides that that's the appropriate place to put the power.
Okay.
Well, they already have the power.
Well, in actual fact, what should happen is that, this is a national issue. We know that. Florida has been impacted more than others, more than other states. Is that the government has to address, though, this shortfall. If a bank has a $400,000 mortgage and the government is going to intervene and say, well, this house is only worth $200,000, so the homeowner should only be paying for a $200,000 mortgage, somebody's got to eat that other $200,000 loss, right?
Right.
And so they've got to address, and if they tell the bank, well, you've got to write off that $200,000 loss, then we could, that's going to put the financial institutions of this country potentially in severe jeopardy, and look what happened. The federal government came and bailed them all out.
Well,
So it's not, there's no one single simple issue. You have to think through the impact upon the financial institutions of the country and the homeowner and the federal government. They're all three players in this situation.
Well, the bankruptcy judges can already write down the principle of investment properties. They just can't do it for residential properties, which is where the big problem is today.
Oh, definitely.
So should they not have the right to do it for residential homeowners who this is their home that they live in as opposed to investment property?
Well, it would seem that they should.
So you would favor that?
Well, it would seem that they should. I'm hesitating because I always like to, when I get ready to make a decision, this is important. It's important for you and it's important for the voters. I'm always going to look at the arguments on both sides of the issues and do my homework so that I can make the best possible decision and be sure that I understand all the facts. So conceptually, I can say that conceptually, it seems that they should be able to, but in all honesty, I've got to, and this is what I'm going to be with the people of Florida, I'm going to be honest. I'm also going to be sure that there are no unintended consequences that I haven't maybe thought through sitting right here in the hot seat today.
You've said that you favor some parts of the health care law, that you oppose some parts. Can you tell us, articulate what those are and what you would do as governor to implement the health care law?
Well, there is a health care law that has been passed out of Congress, and you're right, there are parts of it that are very good for consumers. Some of the things that I've seen firsthand as the CFO, our office is responsible for taking calls in from Floridians who have had trouble or issues with insurance claims and insurance issues, and to provide information. We take almost 200,000, 250,000 calls a year from Floridians and try to help them navigate the insurance system.
Okay,
what do you like, what don't you like, and what will you do as governor?
Well, one of the biggest issues that we've heard in my office is this issue that they call rescission, which people will call, they think they have insurance, but they get sick, and then they call and their insurance company says, oh, page 10 back here, you didn't check off the form right. You don't have insurance. That is a not uncommon practice from insurance companies. That's wrong. This health care bill does not permit insurance companies to engage in that practice any longer. Beginning to close the donut hole for seniors. Permitting children up to the age of 26 to stay on their parents' health insurance. Most importantly, my whole economic plan is built around supporting small businesses. And today, this health care reform bill is already providing tax credits to and incentives to small businesses who provide insurance and approximately 240,000 Florida small businesses are eligible right now for these tax credits because they're providing health insurance. So those are all good things. Some of the aspects of that 2,200-page bill.
Actually, the final bill was about 900 pages.
900 pages? Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Are things that are, as they begin to roll out, that businesses in particular having problems with. One is a requirement for small businesses to submit documentation for every expense over, I think it's over $600 that they have. I mean, that's just unwieldy, and it just adds cost. And
Okay,
what's
if we
the
can
point
get
of
down
it?
to, if this is a congressional matter, but in Congress, do you favor repeal of the health care law, or do you favor changing it
I
in
favor
ways?
fixing it.
Okay.
Well, do you favor the lawsuit to declare it unconstitutional that Florida's
No,
involved?
I don't. I think it was done as a purely political ploy. It's a waste of the Florida taxpayer money. There are other legal entities that can challenge the constitutionality of this law if they wanted to use the meager resources of our state attorney general to focus our attorneys on this kind of lawsuit when, in my opinion, our attorney general lawyers ought to be focused on the foreclosure crisis. They ought to be focused on rampant mortgage fraud. They ought to be focused on $2 to $3 billion worth of Medicaid fraud in the Florida system, and shouldn't have their attention diverted to a lawsuit like that.
The lawsuit alleges that the law is unconstitutional for two reasons. One, the individual mandate, and two, the requirement on Medicaid, which directly affects governors. Can you tell us why you think, from a legal standpoint, the lawsuit is wrong, why you think the law is
No, I
constitutional?
can't at all, Randy, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not
Okay.
going to practice law here.
Okay.
Well, one of the
Well,
things that you'll get to decide is whether we will set up state exchanges or let the
Yes.
federal government do it. Would you push for the state to set up its own exchanges under health care reform, or just let the federal government do it, like we did with the high-risk pool?
Well, right now, as you know, the states were given the option, and I think for this current year, the state chose not to
Do it
set
for the
up,
high risk, yes.
not to do the high risk, which I supported that decision. But going forward, I believe the state is moving towards, well, every state has to set up their own state exchange.
They don't have to. They can let the government
Well,
do it if
it's
they don't want to.
my impression that the insurance commissioner is leading the effort to begin to plan to set up a state exchange. Florida's a big state, so I think that we would have more control over what happens to our own citizens if we're able to set up our own state exchange that addresses maybe some of the some unique needs that we have in Florida, because we have such a huge senior population.
In our newspaper today is one of those stories that's got a lot of potential impact and has those arguments on both sides, and it's the question of whether the Environmental Protection Agency rules for water pollution in Florida are too stringent, and that they will cost farmers and residential utility customers. Are the rules too stringent, or do you agree with environmentalists that there are ways to do it that will not be that costly?
I don't believe they've actually established the rules yet. You're talking about the water nutrient standards, and it's my understanding that they're currently in negotiation. Who's the environmental expert here?
Well,
It's the water, it's the nutrient standards, and it's been in the news because,
the EPA has a number. And,
Yes.
And the reaction in Florida, I believe, has been that number can't be attained.
can be attainable.
Right.
Right.
So,
And-
what do you think?
Well, I think that the EPA has, I've talked to the EPA about this, and because they cannot establish a standard that is going to cause our businesses and our municipalities and our ag interests an incredible financial burden that is possibly not even attainable. There has to be some balance in the system. There has to be a path Clearly, we want clean water in this state. It's really important. It's a part of how we grow in the future. But there has to be the appropriate balance struck. And that's what they're negotiating right now between the EPA and between the people that have to achieve the balance. And I have been very outspoken about this. I've met with Carol Browner in the White House. I've spoken with Lisa Jackson.
She's the EPA administrator.
The EPA administrator. About there's been a lot of work done at our own Department of Environmental Protection, 7 years worth of work to get the science together. So whatever they come with should be based on good science. There's an argument that some of the standards they have set are greater than just the naturally occurring standards that are already in our waterways, that they aren't being very realistic about what really truly is attainable. And I'm worried about our economy.
If you felt that the federal government was going to impose water standards that you thought were unrealistically high, would you sue over that?
Yes, I probably would.
Okay. As governor, you would be in charge of 18 agencies with about 90,000 employees. Do you see yourself cutting some of those employees if you're elected?
Well, in my plan, my reform plan, where I identify $700 million worth of savings, about $300 million of saving comes from streamlining middle management. I did a study within my own department of the ratio of supervisors to employees, something that businesses have been doing for years. Would you believe that in Tallahassee we have a situation where we have a supervisor supervising one person? Yes. And so part of my plan would be to streamline middle management and to increase the number of employees that a supervisor oversees.
So does streamline mean layoffs?
No. The plan, the way to do that is through attrition. And as supervisory positions come open, you don't fill them. And in my own department, I built a plan in which we were able to accomplish our goals within less than an 18-month period, just because we have a lot of state employees who are retiring, they're leaving their positions, and so you don't have to fire somebody in order to streamline middle management.
Do you admire the way Governor Christ has handled his appointments to the Public Service Commission? And would you have a litmus test for appointees?
Well, the difficult, this is not a 30-second answer. Let me
45.
go back.
I'll let you go 45.
Well, the governor doesn't have the ability to choose his own nominee to the PSC. Rather, it's the legislature who presents to the governor a slate of candidates, as we've seen recently.
Well,
and
half legislature and half non-legislature. There are 12 people on the nominating council, and 6 are legislators and 6 are not.
Okay, but it's not the governor's.
It is a creature of the legislature.
It's a creature
yes.
of the legislature. Thank you. It's a creature of the legislature, and so the governor is presented with a slate of names, out of which he has to select from that slate of names. And I think the whole PSC structure needs to be relooked at. The abuses that we've seen in the past couple of years. I agree with the notion that when there's a rape case, the PSC commissioners ought to be more like judges, and there should be limited contact between the PSC commissioners and the petitioners, who would be the utility companies. And I do think that we have to have PSC commissioners that have the highest integrity. And these are complicated, complex cases. So we should have very highly qualified people serving as PSC commissioners.
Both you and Rick Scott have proposed a lot of regulatory reform and spending changes and all these things, both saying that you're doing it from the perspective of a business background. Why do you think yours are more effective than his, would be more effective?
Well, I've been there for 3.5 years, so I've been able to see how things work or don't work. in Tallahassee. And my plans to reform government arise out of the experience and what I've observed actually operating as the state's CFO. So I certainly can speak a lot more about my own plans than I can about his. I know my plans are based on experience and reality and what I believe are possible ways to reform government. Cuts in expenses in certain areas. There's still enormous opportunities there to consolidate IT functions, for example. And why does the state have to have multiple call centers for multiple agencies? We ought to look at combining some of those call centers. I just can't speak really to what his plans are, except that what I've read, for example, he said he could cut $1 billion out of the $2.4 billion corrections budget. That seems highly unlikely and very unrealistic to me.
One thing he did say...
And besides, they're not very, as I understand, they're not very many specifics. He's throwing out a lot of numbers, but he hasn't really put the meat on the bone specifically of how he achieves these cuts.
Right. Well, one proposal he has made, and this can lead us into a conversation about education for a moment, is that he would lower by 1 mil what is known as the required local effort, the local property tax share to pay for public schools. And he says that would save $1 billion plus somewhere.
So he's going to cut the school budget again.
He says that that he would pay for that with savings elsewhere.
So if he's going to do that, he should identify specifically where those elsewhere savings are.
Well, to talk about specifics, the state has been getting by on $1 billion a year from the stimulus, from the federal stimulus to pay for teachers and other parts of education. That money is going to be going away. What is your plan for education, and what is your plan specifically to make up, if there is one, to make up the $1 billion that the state's going to lose from the stimulus?
I've already identified in my plan $700 million of savings that I believe can be taken out without hurting programmatic parts of the state government. And there are other items within the budget that are, there are a number of areas that we can find cuts. Now, let's say it's going to be hard. This governor and legislature over the past 2 or 3 years have cut almost $7 billion from our state budget. So we're getting down to the bare bones, and so what we have to do is set our priorities.
Well, do you think that the funding for education will go down then?
No, I'm not planning on cutting education. Education, as we grow our economy again, and over the course of my administration, education is going to be one of my top priorities, because we can't achieve my economic plan, which is to diversify our economy and attract 21st century jobs into our state, unless we're supporting public education.
Okay, but what I hear is that we're going to lose $1 billion in federal funding, and you have identified $700 million in cuts, and if all of that went to education, you'd still be short. I mean, are you talking about trying to hold education harmless? Or are you talking about trying to spend more on education, or?
Well, I'm definitely going to go in. I'm going to go into the budget season next year as governor, holding education harmless, and I'm going to be scrambling around to find additional opportunities to streamline and save to increase our funding in education. Particularly over the course of my administration, our economy is going to turn around, and we'll have the ability to invest in some of the things. The people of Florida are going to hear me talk a lot about investment. We should be investing more in our pre-K programs, because it is proven that if we invest more in four-year-old education, then we will have far fewer third graders having to repeat a grade. And that's an enormous payback for us. Invest in a four-year-old so that third grader, we don't have to pay for that third grader to spend another year in third grade. So the this is going to require a lot of leadership. It's going to require knowledge and leadership and the ability to work across party lines. And that's something that I have proven to be able to do. You have a list of the accomplishments that I've had as the state's CFO by working across party lines. And I think the people of Florida are tired of partisanship. They want to see that the people are working together to make the right things happen, not the wrong things happen, as we've seen this legislature attempt to do several times over.
Well, as you...
If that's the case, though, you watch the Republican leadership basically criticize sharply your opponent when he was running in the primary, and when it came time to pick a candidate now, why aren't more of them coming over to your side?
Well, it's I think it's very interesting to note that I've already had almost 24 elected Republican officials around this state endorse my candidacy. I've had law enforcement officers, Republican sheriffs endorse me because they believe that I have the kind of integrity and honesty and problem-solving ability that our state needs right now. And there are many questions about my opponent.
And yet the leadership is thrown in with Rick Scott.
Well, of course, they're partisan Republicans. That's what they do.
How are you going to get Democrats to the polls? How are you going to energize your own party given the anti-incumbent sentiment in the country and the polls that show Democrats are just not enthusiastic about voting in this midterm election?
Well, we're beginning to see a shift in those attitudes, particularly in the last, I'd say in the last 2 or 3 weeks. People really are waking up and realizing that there's a lot at stake in this race. Floridians certainly have a clear choice in this governor's race. And I believe that Floridians are understanding that they want a governor who will support public education. They want a governor who has the experience, 25 years of experience I've had right here in Florida, working in business. I've spent my career figuring out how to make loans to small businesses right here in our state. I've been a contributor and a leader in our state. And I am not going to be beholden to special interest like the Republican legislators are. And this Republican governor will be beholden to special interest.
Well, now, he would say he's paying for his campaign himself.
Well, let me make something, I'm glad you asked me that, because that's what he said. That's how he ran his Republican primary campaign. So why was it within a week of his election, he was right up in Tallahassee, right in bed with AIF and the special interest and taking $2 million from U.S. Sugar Corporation? I think that's pretty hypocritical.
Speaking of which...
Oh, by the way, can I ask you a question? Because I gather we're about to wrap up.
No, we got about 10 minutes.
Oh, is he coming here to meet with you?
He's not accepted our kind offer just yet. So,
Well, it just seems interesting to me that my opponent is not making himself available to any editorial boards that I know of. It's really disappointing for the voters.
we wanted to get one thing on before we wound up. An appeals court in Miami just overturned the state's ban on gay adoptions, and the governor has said, based on that, he's just not going to enforce it. Assuming that there are no other challenges, would you follow that policy? Would you appoint a secretary of the Department of Children, Families, and Services and say, we're not going to enforce this? As far as I'm concerned, gays and lesbians can adopt children in this state. Well,
what my position all along from the very beginning has been that I'm a mother and I have 2 children myself, and I think I think that the decisions about the children involved ought to be made with the judge, in conjunction with the judge and the appropriate social workers and the people who are closest to those children. And so I would not advocate pursuing the litigation at all.
And at one point early on your time as CFO, you had talked about sort of setting for yourself a goals list when your first term was over. Would you be willing to do that as governor?
Oh, yes. we're going to set goals. We're going to set some goals for high school graduation rates. Go ahead.
No, go, please.
We're going to set some goals for high school graduation rates. We're going to set some goals for the way that we do budgeting in terms of making the whole budget process more transparent for Floridians, so we can all understand more about how the budget is set. I'm going to set some. Governor Childs appointed me, and I was the chair of the Government Accountability to the People Commission. We put together a report card. We said, here's where we are now. This is our aspiration for where we want to be in the future, and the Floridians are going to see a scorecard from me.
All right, and if you were elected, you'd be willing to set that and then run on it, run on your performance
I sure
for re-election?
would. I sure would.
All right.
Because I'm not there. I'm not going there not to accomplish good things for Floridians.
Thank you, Ms. Sink. We appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
All right.